Good Sunday morning, everybody. Father Leo here again, and I hope to bring you a message. And naturally, I always hope that my message somehow speaks to you or resonates with you and helps you in living this great gift of life. It's a gift we have, and we live for a length of time, so we like to live it well. So that's where my starting point is today. Now, Sunday, June the 12th, it's the Feast of the Most Holy Trinity. And there's been a lot of deep books written by great theologians about the Trinity. I've read some of them, and I still don't know what the heck they were talking about. It's too deep for me. So for those who can read the books on the Trinity by great theologians and understand them, more power to you. But you're going to have to excuse me because I can't handle it. But there is something I get from the Trinity which really resonates with me, and that's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And that's a sense of community, of relationality, of relations, of relationships, and how vitally important they are for living our life. Now, you know and I know that we live in a culture that stresses individuality, self-sufficiency, being your own master, and like I say, individuality. So it really does, our culture really defeats the very purpose of what I'm talking today, which is community. Let's go back. My experience of community. It began when I was a kid. We were a family, a farm family in a neighborhood, and that's the key word here is neighborhood. And it was a real genuine neighborhood. Neighboring, community, bonding, helping one another, being there for one another in the difficult times and in the good times. It was all part of the stuff of that neighborhood in that part of the township. I remember that every fall or late summer, if you will, there was a thrashing. And a neighbor who owned a thrashing machine would come to your barn, and the neighbors would gather, and there would be maybe 20 men. And they would take turns with the various chores of bringing the sheaves of grain to that particular thrashing machine, where they would be thrashed, the grain in the granary and the straw in the straw pile. And then of course, once they'd done that, the thrasher would move on to the next neighbor. And since I was only a kid, my two brothers would go, because they were adults. And they would make it rounds for maybe 15 to 20 different barns, because that's what neighbors did. They rotated from barn to barn to barn, from farm to farm, and the thrashing all got done. And it was a wonderful thing. It wasn't so wonderful for the women, because the women had to put up 2 big meals every day. 2 big meals for about 20 men. And I can sure remember seeing my mother work very hard that day. Well, 2 or 3 days before, cooking pies and getting supplies in, cooking big meals, peeling potatoes and vegetables. And it was a lot of work for the women. But they did it because it was tradition. It was a good tradition in the sense of neighboring, because then her own 2 oldest sons would disappear for a week or longer as they moved from other farms and found their meals there. But the thing is, it wasn't just like the thrashing in the late summer. Whenever there was a crisis of any kind, it could be that a farmer's animal was sick, because it was a telephone exchange, which if you rang neighbor Smith, neighbor Jones was going to pick up the phone and do. So, it was a kind of a phone line where everybody knew what was happening, what everybody else was doing. And I remember on Sunday the pastor would say, you shouldn't be listening in on other people's phone calls. And everybody would kind of smile, yeah, Father, but they would still do it. And I don't blame them. So it was the grapevine. It was the way that the good news, the bad news spread. And but anyway, if a neighbor had a sick animal, word to get around, and neighbors would come to see how they could treat that sick animal. I remember one particular neighbor, his barn burnt down. Now that's a major crisis, catastrophe. And how the farmers in that neighborhood, in that part of the township, on the barn raising day, gathered to raise the barn. You can see pictures of it as they gathered with muscle power. Back in those days, there weren't the big machines that they have today, but it was muscle power. And with muscle power, they raised that barn and completed the structure. And very soon that farmer was back in business. And he had a place for his cattle and horses and all the other animals which he owned. But he called on the neighbors came. And they came and helped out. So neighboring, and on Sunday afternoon, very often my mother and father would disappear. And what they would do, they just drive to one of the neighbors. And it seemed to be osmosis, that the neighbors knew who they would go to. Because when they would arrive, so would other neighbors. And pretty soon, you had a gathering of people. And of course, there was tea and cookies. But there was talk. There was bonding. There was friendship. There was we care. And if somebody in the neighborhood was sick, again, the neighbors came and helped out. And so you were never alone, that sense of relationality. And that's something that kind of, I think we need to restore, especially with this pandemic, when you couldn't really neighbor very well. And the culture that says be your own master of your own destiny, be an individual, individualism, it's counterproductive in quality of life, in my opinion. And so this is why on this Trinity Sunday, I'm stressing about the notion of community. Now, community has various aspects of it. And the first is the bonding. It is a bonding. Or the word commitment. I know that word commitment doesn't fit our culture today. That you make a commitment, I'm a member of this neighborhood, and by golly, I'm not going to get thrown out of it. You know, I belong, a sense of belonging, and everybody needs to feel they belong. And to not belong is a terrible feeling, but to belong, and that's community. It gives a person a sense of belonging, and out of that they get their identity, they get their meaning and purpose of life. They get the bonding with fellow people that are like-minded, where people really love one another, and where that love is lived with behavior and with actions. And so community is vitally important. And I think part of our religion, and where we're broke down, is it became law-oriented. Now, we're not surprised at that, because when you read the Gospels, Jesus critiqued the religion of his day for being obedience to the law. Obedience to the law was the sign that you were a good religious person. And Jesus says, well, not quite. He says there is a higher law. And that's the law of love, if you want to call it that. And so it's not obedience to rules and regulations, and God knows our religion had enough of them. The Code of Canon Law, if you ever saw it, I had to study it, I had to pass exams on it, and as a matter of fact, it was my best subject. I always got marks in the 90s on canon law, of all things. the darndest thing. I guess maybe what it gave me was I knew what laws to break. But it was crazy when I think of it now, after all those years. But canon law. But you should have seen the number of laws. Honest to God, if you saw a canon law book that I studied, it was that thick. It was that thick. It had so many canon laws in it. And obedience was a big thing. When I'd be asked for a recommendation, then the first question would be, is this person obedient to the beliefs of the church? And you either said yes or no. Obedience. Obedience was a big thing. And of course, as an ordained priest, you're supposed to be obedient to the bishop. Now, I don't know who the bishop was obedient to. They always seem to be obedient only to themselves. But that's neither here nor there, as far as I'm concerned. But I do know that I, as a priest, was supposed to be obedient to the bishop. Well, I always had a little trouble with that, because I could think for myself. And I had studied moral theology, and I had moral principles that said to me, make your decision on moral principles, not on blind obedience. And okay, and that's what I've done. And it's the only way I was able to put people first was by following moral principles. So it wasn't as if I was any kind of a rebel. It was simply I chose a different platform. I chose moral principles over blind obedience to rules. So pay your money, take your choice. That was my choice. But the big thing about religion, it was meant to be relational. Relational. And that's what Jesus had in mind when he spoke about today's gospel. You know, it's relational. His relationship with God. It's relationship. And how neighboring, or maybe today we use, because we're more in the city, we use the word community. And I know out where I come from, the farming community as neighbors doesn't exist anymore. The farmers are pretty well all moved away, and farms are simply unused or being rented out. But there is very little, and the factory farms have taken over. And with all the computers, they don't need neighbors. So it's a different world today. But coming back to living in the city, it's community. And certainly this is where Christianity should come in, with relationships. And for that, you got to get together. You got to know people, know their names. Remember that show they had on TV a few years ago? I want to go to the bar where everybody knows my name. Sure, people want to be known by their name. And so that's the key to today's scripture reading. And my reflection on it is relationality, relationships, bonding, belonging, being loved and loving. Who am I going to love? My neighbors, members of my community. Yeah, and that's where the life is really nurtured. Now, this is of particular interest to me today because we just got notification from headquarters that churches are now wide open for people to come to church on Sunday. Okay, I don't know what's going to happen. It's going to be interesting. Are there going to be any more people to show up this weekend than last weekend? Now, I've talked to two people from two different parishes here in Peterborough, and they tell me up till now it's been a handful of people coming to those churches. A handful. When you think of a church that will hold over 500 people and having 40 people there for Mass, what have you got? I know a church which will hold 600 people, and they maybe have 15 or 20 people for Mass. Now, will those figures double? I don't know. We have a church that's falling apart, and 2.3 million fundraiser to repair it. But, how many people are going to that building? So, and why are we investing millions of dollars on a building and not in people? Like the homeless, the poor, the hungry. I don't get it. So somehow that whole thing has got shifted to the side, distorted. And what is religion has got distorted. Religio, to bind together, to walk together, companions on the journey. That's not just a euphemism. Relationships makes us companions on the journey. People to lean on when we need to lean. People to draw energy from. People to call us by name. People who love us. People for us to call by name. People to love. So this is it, and it really bothers me that we're still here in the 21st century, still dragging that old dead horse behind us. Let's get with it. Let's get with the program. And this is particularly significant for those who belong to our virtual community. Our virtual community is at a kind of a fork in the road, if you will. Do we continue with Zoom, or do we locate a place where we can have a hybrid celebration of the Eucharist, which means we would gather as people in the same place, be it open air, tent, doesn't matter to me, in a hall, doesn't matter to me, and also Zoom it. So what's going to be curious to me is to find out how many people on Sunday morning, when I lay this out, are they going to take responsibility? Are they going to do what Catholics generally do? Well, Father Leo will look after us. This time, old Father Leo can't. He is simply too old. 90 years. I do not have the energy. Now, I believe in it, and I think that we have so many capable people on Sunday morning, but are they going to simply pass the buck to me? Well, if they do, it's game over. It's game over. I'm not going to. I can't. I don't have the energy. I don't have the energy to take responsibility for this. It has to be the people that you want the Mass. And after that, I'll preside. Yes, I will. I will attend to you. Yes, I will. I'll baptize your babies. Well, to be your grandkids or great-grandkids. I'll bury your dead. I'll visit your sick. You can come to me and tell me your troubles. I'll be with you and pray with you. Yes, I will. But the one thing I'm not going to do is take responsibility for answering this particular question. Where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? And I have faint suspicion that it could easily come down the pipe, Dwayne, that we are to discontinue Zoom or streaming masses. The diocese is quitting, and my guess is they'll be telling us to quit. Now, you and I have been familiar with it because we're into virtual reality. Not everybody is. And so we have to keep that in mind when we are juggling this particular question. What are we to do? And it's going to be interesting tomorrow for me to see whether or not people care enough to say, we'll look after this. We'll make the decision. And next Sunday we'll tell you. That's what I need to hear, because I can't do it anymore as much as I'd like to. So that's my homily for the day on this Trinity Sunday. It tells me everything about Christian living. It tells me about all the benefits of belonging to a community, but there's also responsibility. If you belong and I belong to a community, we all have responsibilities for the well-being of that community. And am I the only one? I hope not. I hope not. Because if I am, then the community is going to go down the tube. God bless.